I love sociology, right? And how people interact with each other and how some of the things we can create and make and how it changes their experience and either their interaction with that product or their interaction with each other. And I was just wildly curious to see if I just went in and installed this thing, how would people interact with it? Um, for me, it just became obvious. Well, I got to dress up like an IKEA employee. I've got to put a couple of these in my backpack and just go in there and pretend like I work there. So that's what we did.
Hello and welcome to Experimentation Masters, the leading resource for business experimentation. Join fellow innovators, strategists, and entrepreneurs to learn practical tips, methods, and techniques from world-leading experts in experimentation. Design better experiments, lead with more confidence, and have greater impact in your organization. Now please welcome your host, Gavin Bryant.
Hello and welcome to the Experimentation Masters podcast. Today, I would like to welcome Justin Porcano to the show. Justin is a Senior Industrial Design Manager at Accenture. He works with design and engineering teams to research, test, and deliver new products. Justin has worked with some of the world's leading brands, including Belkin, HP, and Teague. Prior to Accenture, for 7 years, Justin owned and operated design consultancy Upwell Designs. He's also the co-founder of Save Site Now Foundation, an organization dedicated to finding a treatment for Usher Syndrome Type 1B. In this episode, we're going to discuss how at Upwell Design, Justin hacked IKEA to test a new product idea, the Wall Hub. Welcome to the show, Justin.
Thanks for having me.
So, Justin, I usually start with asking people to provide an overview of their background. So you've had quite a varied background. You've been a business owner and also worked for some of the world's leading design agencies. Would you like to give our listeners a bit of an overview of that journey so far?
Sure. I'll try and keep it brief. My foundational education was in architecture. I'm born and raised on the East Coast before moving out west to change careers from architecture to go into industrial design at Art Center College of Design. I love the field of architecture, but the profession of architecture didn't exactly work for me. But I'll never take that education for granted. It's basically the foundation for my thought process and problem solving skills. After Art Center, I went to work for Target for a brief stint. Then I landed a dream job working at Pentagram in San Francisco for Robert Brunner, the ex-creative director of Apple, now the creative director and owner of Ammunition. Worked for, prior to that, or after Pentagram, went on to New Deal Design, another tier one firm working on consumer electronics in San Francisco as well. And then I ventured out and started my own kind of one-man show consultancy business called Upwell Design, where I either work in-house with some of these tier one companies as a contractor, or I work direct with client. And this typically ranged from anything from furniture to lighting to consumer electronics to wearables. I've done a lot of furniture in my past life, and love that scale. I think it's a happy medium between architecture and physical and product design. It's this thing that you can kind of still embraces you and envelops you, but it's not something you hold in your hand. And then after Upwell Design, worked for clients like Toyota and Belkin and Bernhardt, doing all sorts of things, like I mentioned, from handheld products to furniture. Moved on to a small company called Matter, where they were focusing on kind of the intersection of physical and digital design. I think it's hard to separate the two nowadays as far as the amount of product that's coming onto market. Most of the things we interact with are connected somehow. Basically every physical product at this point, or half of them at least, are almost connected in some way or form. And then we were acquired by Accenture. So I wound up at Accenture by means of acquisition, from Matter to a service and digital design company by the name of Fjord, who was internal at Accenture. And I find myself there today as a senior design manager, focusing on industrial design, but also that intersection of kind of digital and physical, doing a lot of work around understanding user needs through research and testing, which means designing a lot of testing, doing a lot of research, and understanding the impacts user needs have on industrial design and engineering.
So what are some of those key distinctions that you've seen from conducting your own small agency to working in-house for a larger firm?
Oh, wow. I mean, the differences are night and day. I think when, Accenture's 600,000 people internationally, you know, just let alone the amount of incoming emails are enough to occupy half your day as far as responding to or irrelevant or irrelevant. And yeah, versus, in independent, when you're an independent contractor or a sole proprietor, you wear every hat, you do everything, whether that is bringing in clients, doing the work you have, controlling what you look like externally from a marketing point of view. You wear every single hat there is. When you're internal, it's nice. You've got a team, or you work, or you run, or lead a couple teams, and you can kind of really focus on one thing at a time.
Awesome. So thinking about your key principles for design and experimentation, what would some of those key things be?
Oh man. Yeah, well, we like to create things called experience prototypes. It's probably a fairly familiar term with most folks in the industry. And that's the idea of how fast can you get to understanding users' needs, their use cases, and solving them. So we work through a process of a lot of times clients will come to us and treat us like an R&D team, where they say we've got an idea for this type of sensor or this type of button on our flagship product because we want to do this for the user. So a lot of time, it's my team's job to then say, okay, well, first, the first questions are, does this button make sense? Is it the right way to implement it? And do your users even want this? So we'll create experiments. It's been hard during COVID. You can't exactly recruit people. So being really savvy on how you do testing and design and research during a global pandemic has been a challenge. But I think our team has pivoted and done really well in kind of getting super savvy and creative around testing. It's one of the benefits of a 600,000 person firm is that you've got a couple people you can access internally for research. So we did that with a couple local folks. We designed tests and we basically run them through these tests. That's 90% of our job right now is to understand, first of all, is there a use case for this thing that the client wants to do? If there is, what's the appropriate way, or what's the best way to provide the user with a solution? And then we test and validate all those potential solutions and look at the trade space. So if you go down this route, yes, while that increases the overall user experience, you might ding a sustainability aspect that you care about because of the material selection or the complexity in manufacturing or engineering. So you bubble up all these trade-offs depending on the solution you move forward with, and then you present those options to the client and let them make a very informed business decision.
So you mentioned at the start of your overview there that do customers even want this? Is that a question that companies are more readily asking, or are companies still overlooking that key premise and just moving to build?
Yeah, I'd say by the time they've come to us, they're not asking that question anymore. They're under the impression that users do want this. A lot of times they have a predefined solution in mind, and that's often not the right solution as far as execution. But we always take a step back. We always first ask is this fulfilling a need by their user base? And for us, in order to answer that, we need to really understand who their users are and what they're looking for. But to your point, most clients come to us with a fairly good understanding if this is something their users want and need, and just need help understanding on, okay, what exactly is it and how do we implement it?
Okay, so the client would obviously lead with their own research, and there's some insights that have produced that understanding, and you really help them to flesh that out and validate that user need, and to really help them understand what's the best version of the thing that they think they should maybe be implementing?
Yeah, like, nine times out of 10, it's very reactionary. Sometimes clients some clients are savvy enough to kind of do a little future forecasting or have the finances and resources to have a team who does future forecasting. A lot of times it's also reactionary. Maybe they're getting their lunch eaten by a competitive client who's already got that heart rate sensor or that retinal scanner on their phone because people decided that's a valuable way to unlock something, or it unlocks an accessibility issue that's cutting out half of their demographic. And then they're asking us, okay, well, here's our phone. How do we do it better, or how do we do it right? That's just a poor example, but an example of something.
So thinking about those guiding principles, you've been working around product development experimentation for well over a decade now. How have your guiding principles evolved over time, if at all?
Yeah, guiding principles. It's so different super high level. It's the ability to first, principle number one, understand who your user is, right? And use whatever research means necessary it is to understand them and cast as wide of the net as possible. Understand what your client's business needs are. And make sure that those align with the user's needs. And then when it comes down to kind of principles, it's a matter of being empathetic, I think, and understanding the context. That there's no magic or guiding set of guidelines like list of principles 1 through 5 for me at least. Every project we get, because, Accenture and how we typically act, we don't produce a product. We act almost as like a consultancy. So we take a deep dive into whoever the new client space is, whether that's, are they in the fitness area? Are they in the gaming area? Are they in the kind of productivity area? And we learn as much as we can about that space as quick as we can. And then we, between understanding the content, the context, user needs, and business and client needs, you start to design, kind of test and do applicable research that makes sense.
No, I mean, summarize there, the key takeaway there is understand your user and be empathetic and be willing to learn through whatever means, whether that's qualitative, quantitative means, to have the deepest understanding of that user needs before you continue.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thinking, let's take a stroll down memory lane now and go back to Upwell Design and to WallHub. Where did the idea for WallHub come from? What was the inspiration?
Yeah, I think that originated from a Muji competition. God, I don't know how many years ago now, 2006. Where the ask was create a home product that lived on the peripheral of a space. That was it. That was the brief. It was pretty wide at that point. I constantly lose my keys. You ask my wife, and she'll be the first person to tell you that. And I have a pretty regimented process, and I think we all do. Keys, phones, wallet, cell phone before you walk out the door. And just brainstorming and looking around the room and thinking how you can support a process like that, and thinking about an object that lives on the periphery. Just wall plates, just light switch wall plates became this existing thing that lives within our infrastructure and within our homes that felt like it could have been upgraded for more function than covering up a hole in the wall or slop in the wall from an electrical box. It was there already. So let's make some better use out of it or add some function to it.
Yeah, an interesting, a different way of thinking about exploration and discovery rather than completely coming from a user need. It was maybe an underutilized space that could potentially solve a problem. So just before we move on, the example of WallHub and with the IKEA experiment that Justin performed is one that I use in my workshops regularly. I think that it's an amazing example of being really industrious, really creative to gather data and information quickly and cheaply from customers to understand demand and interest. And in this example that we're going to talk through, Justin used an existing retail space in IKEA with existing foot traffic, effectively planting the wall hub in the physical premise, and then observing the reactions and behaviors of customers with this, what perceived to be a new product. So thinking about the wall hub, just moving along to the next step there, there's been an identification of an opportunity to use a light switch, a plate to provide a new product or service. So you mentioned earlier that through your career in architecture that you developed, really sound thinking processes and problem-solving processes. So what was that high-level problem-solving process that you worked through from identification of a potential idea through to IKEA, where you were testing live in the wild?
Yeah. Oh man, there are so many things that go into that. One, starts with simple affordance, my ability to, there are issues like how do I get keys on and off a hook that without actually actuating the light switch, like if I'm in a dark room, so going through the motions of what a user might do. I enter a room, I leave a room. What are my physical interactions that without thinking about without thinking about the product, how would I engage this thing intuitively? So I think the first thing is to kind of lay out a user journey, right? And understand all those steps of interaction, whether, everything from approaching to turning off the lights, to finding your keys, to walking out the door, to opening and closing the door. You start to use that as a little bit of a blueprint, and understand where these points of friction might exist and these potential areas you need to solve for. And there's a whole other side around manufacturability and want and need, right? There are, I know, in the US, there are single gang, double gang, triple gang. There are toggle variations. There are decora variations as far as styles. And that was probably the biggest problem working against us, the amount of potential issues and SKUs. And for a startup to put out 10 different SKUs in production is a lot to spend when out the gate. Ideally, you want one nice little product and you sell it and make some money off it and kind of, build on that. But if you only put one of these out, and let's say you've got the bulk of your mass to the right of the switch and you're too close to a door frame, well, now that renders that useless for users. So one of our early solves were to make this thing flippable, and that's by creating a blank and allowing the user to flip over and plug a blank in, which is why it has a blank. So you solve that left to right issue, but then you still have your SKU problem. So you have to go out and identify, okay, what are the most popular SKUs to launch with? So we do that. Then there are manufacturing constraints around how many parts can you manufacture. You want to keep it as cheap as possible. So how do you design the part breakup to, for injection molding? What type of plastic do you want? There are all these considerations. How wide are the hooks? How many hooks do you want on there? How should they snap? Should they snap in and out? Should it be permanent? What's the price point? So all these things are constantly competing for space and time with each other. And there's a push and pull here as far as what you prioritize and what you begin to let go, either based on cost or user experience.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so moving forward a little bit, so assuming that there is a prototype product available now, you ran a Kickstarter campaign. Could you share an overview of the Kickstarter campaigns and the learning and insights that came from that process?
Yeah, I mean, my point of view is probably dated by now, considering I think this is like 10 years ago. I'm sure there are new tactics out there. But yeah, the first and only valuable thing to a Kickstarter campaign is a well-done video, and even production quality counts in this case. High production value for sure, on top of a really thorough explanation and a story about why the need is there, and why people want to buy it. I think those are the three things you kind of need to take away with that. For us, the first time we launched, we didn't clear that Kickstarter hurdle because of that flippability between left and right. So we went back, we redesigned so it could be flipped from left and right, engineered that, relaunched. By the time I relaunched, I already had a contract manufacturer on board who wanted a partner. So we were launching more as, Kickstarter was at that point used as a little bit of marketing, a little bit of pre-sales, even if we had a Kickstarter goal or not. we were still launching the product.
Okay, so from version 1 Kickstarter to version 2, so the key piece of feedback that you received from customers was the flippability?
Yeah, like if you had the envelope holder, it gets pretty long, and most light switches are near entryways, and if you've got molding around an entryway and your light switch is too close, you're kind of screwed if you've got it to one side and you can't exactly fit it because the molding's in the way. So that became, everyone was like, oh, is it only to the right? Is it only to the right? My light switch is on the left. And it's like, oh yeah, that's something I should have picked up on or foreseen. But you miss stuff. And that's what happens when you don't do user testing. I did no user testing on that product.
Okay. So for round 1 on Kickstarter, you didn't make the hurdle. You got invaluable feedback from consumers, and then you reworked it, you iterated, and then, do I understand correctly, for version 2 Kickstarter, you set the threshold lower than version 1, and you end up oversubscribed?
We might have. I don't remember where our price point was on version 2. We did clear that hurdle. But I don't remember what the number was. It was pretty low. It was like, in Kickstarter, like some Kickstarters like need $100,000. We were probably around $15,000 or $20,000, I think.
Yeah. I was just thinking as I was stepping through that example that was a deliberate tactic to hit the threshold lower in the second version, to then send the Kickstarter algorithm whirring to then provide more focus and exposure to the Wall Hub.
Yeah, we had, so prior to Kickstarter or in between the two campaigns, we won an award to go show at ICFF. That's the International Contemporary Furniture Fair in New York, where it gets a lot of publicity. It's super modern, and so we won a booth there, which is pretty expensive to have a booth there. But we won for free. We gained the interest of a local or US based contract manufacturer. And we were off to the races then. At that point, the second Kickstarter became a marketing tool and a way to kind of test, a marketing tool and a way to get pre-sales for us.
So was IKEA the third step in that process? You mentioned Kickstarter, the design show, and then IKEA was number 3?
Yeah, IKEA was, I think when I first started the design or the conceived this, I always thought it'd be an interesting idea because it just felt like an IKEA product as far as its functionality, and minimalism. And I thought it'd just be interesting to throw it in there and see how people reacted. Like, what's the worst that could happen? You lose a couple of wall hubs. And then later, I think once we got further along, we're like, I was just looking for a way to kind of create some buzz about, I wanted to sell in IKEA and places like Home Depot and these big retailers. And I think, it was two-pronged. It was, how do you create some buzz and marketing interest around it, and get creative in that space? And can we make a video out of it like we did? And also, can you provide evidence for retailers that there's a want and need for it?
One of the things that I was thinking about with the original prototype, you mentioned that this was going back 15 or more years now. Is that something that you could have quickly hacked together, like a CAD design and 3D printed now?
Yeah, and what's funny is we didn't have 3D printers on our desktops then. I do now. I'm sitting right next to one. So I did prototype these, but I had to go outside a house to do this. I had to send them out and prototype them, and they were wildly expensive to do it back then. But yeah, hands down, this is something you would just print and make as many copies as you can. But no matter how many I made or copied, if I'm only testing within my household and my context, I'm going to work on whatever works that light switch behind me over there, right? I don't understand everyone's, without having a wide pool of testers to test with. You miss these kind of these little things that maybe aren't obvious to you but are obvious to other users.
So let's jump into the IKEA experiment now. So I'll post a link to Justin's video, which is up on YouTube. I think that has garnered around 80,000 views. So the video received a lot of traction and a lot of buzz, which was the intent of the exercise. So let's just thinking to the start of that IKEA experiment, how did it all come about?
How did that come about? Well, it's definitely something I want. It's definitely something I wanted to do. like I think as an industrial designer and a designer in general, like I kind of get off on like my products interacting with people and using them for like like I love sociology, right? And how people interact with each other and how some of the things we can create and make and how it changes their experience and either their interaction with that product or their interaction with each other. And I was just wildly curious to see if I just went in and installed this thing, how would people interact with it? So, for me, it just became obvious. Well, I got to dress up like an IKEA employee. I've got to put a couple of these in my backpack and just go in there and pretend like I work there. So that's what we did. We got a couple of the production prototypes. We went out and scouted it one day to understand what locations would make the most amount of sense, where we would film from, who would be mic'd up, where we would have mics and camera people. I think there were like 3 or 4 of us that were kind of running around doing this. Trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. And then the goal was just to get as much audio and video as we could in as many locations and then cut it all later.
Mm-hmm. So thinking about that day, how many wall hubs did you take along with you on that day?
Probably about 30.
30?
40. Yep.
And how many did customers pick up and try to purchase?
I think we left with like 10.
Really?
So in a span of like in maybe 2 hours, to go through that much product in 2 hours, that has no point of purchase kind of display or call out, except they were just stuck on a wall or on a shelf was pretty good.
Yeah, that's pretty insane, isn't it? 2 hours, 75% of the product went, and from the footage that you'll be able to see in the YouTube clip, that there is a strong intention and commitment to pay. People take them to the register and try and purchase them.
Yeah, it's probably one of the highlights of the video.
One of the highlights for me was that you ate the meatballs at IKEA. Did you end up with food poisoning?
No, not this time.
Not this time? So thinking post-experiment now, so just to summarize the experiment, Justin, off eBay, he bought an IKEA Polo, packed up around 40 wall hub devices and scoped out the IKEA prior to they affixed their wall hubs to various locations. Then the team filmed video and audio as customers interacted and tried to purchase them. So post-experiment, you get back, you're analysing all the data and information. What's the team thinking?
Pretty much that we're lucky to get out of there with that much good footage and audio and not be not be arrested. This was a time when I think people were super sensitive. We're not that far away from 9/11. So some random person running around in a store, putting stuff on walls, just not a good look in a public space. Security eventually approached us at the end and they were onto us. And they were kind enough to not do anything except kindly ask us to leave.
Okay. So did the team think about testing multiple locations and different geographies, or it was just the one location?
It was just the one location. It was a pretty significant effort, and the people I brought along with me, they're just contracting to help me and work on that. And I think we got a pretty good amount of information from that quote unquote stunt. And we got a lot of great marketing traction out of it as well.
Mm-hmm. So one of the the key indicators there was customers were willing to pay for it, which is it's always one of the strongest forms of evidence from a customer. What were some of the other key insights that you drew from the experiment that informed next direction for WallHub?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of other valuable learnings from that experiment was one around packaging and one around location within the retail space. Is this an impulse buy that should be at it? We located in a couple spots. We located it in like an area around storage, right? So it was in their storage area. We located in the area that was pre-set up. IKEA always have these kind of pre-set up living room scenarios or kitchen set up so you can see how the product would work or function or live within the space. And then we set it up at basically at checkout to understand where did it perform best and was the packaging clear enough for people to understand what the product was. You're also your product language and your visual design language is different than the existing Kia packaging. You're not trying to be a Kia, but you're also trying to not stand out too much. So that there were definitely learnings around there.
Did you end up approaching IKEA, the category managers, to present them with the findings of the experiment?
No, I mean, God, half the battle of getting into retail is getting in touch with the right person. And IKEA, I think headquarters being overseas, obviously from here, that's kind of like a locked vault. I have no idea. They try and do all their stuff internally. Being an outside designer, 9 times out of 10, they're hiring some fairly big local names, in Sweden and Scandinavian countries to do kind of these unique spots within IKEA. They'll do a piece of pottery or they'll do a line of flatware. I wasn't quite exactly a big Scandinavian name.
Mm-hmm. So thinking about some of the challenges or mistakes that startups or companies that you've seen, one of the key things you hit on earlier was when conducting that early prototyping, early experimentation, that it should be really fast. The velocity is really important to be able to generate learning insights from users and customers as fast as possible. What are some of the challenges you see with early stage experimentation for product testing?
I think again, like the challenges that I guess that I would see is missing the mark on who your user is, because you design your test around understanding your user is or the expectation, or like, you can't design a test for somebody if you don't know who they are or what their needs are, or even their age group, or whether it's a physical thing, attribute or an age thing. If you haven't correctly identified the target market base, your tests aren't going to be that good. Like results are only as good as results are only as valuable as the test was designed. So if it's a poorly designed test, your results don't mean much, no matter how good the test results look. So I would say a lot of the challenges are designing an accurate test based on an accurate definition of the target user. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you just miss the mark on who the user is.
Yeah. So in 2022, do you think generally companies have a good enough understanding of who their customers and users are?
With all the data out there, yes, I would hope they have a pretty good idea of who their users are. Satisfying their needs. Like a feature set, like it needs to have this or it needs to have that. I think on how that gets implemented is where we help out the most. I think they have a decent hand on some of these new spaces, though. Like I mentioned in VR, we don't have a good idea on who our consumers are, especially if it's a niche kind of thing. Is it a fitness thing? Is it strictly gaming? Is it a health thing? I think, on these new emerging kind of markets, it's hard to really get a grasp on who your user is per bucket or per category.
I think that's a really good point, that there's so much data and information. There's so much that we know about our customers, but the missing link or the black hole is that interconnection between customer and needs. So advice to businesses is to spend more time trying to articulate those needs, pain points, problems to be solved, and customer jobs. Yeah, so thinking about your key pieces of advice, if our listeners, they have a great new idea for a new product or service, what advice would you give to them to be able to test quickly, cheaply, so they can gather evidence to make data-informed decisions?
Test quickly and cheaply. Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on their resources that they have available, right? Is this a client who just doesn't have that capability? Or is this a design team who a client has just come to? In order to oh man, it's a tough one. Again, are we talking about a physical product, a digital product? Are we talking about one that is living at the intersection of both of these things? The the best thing that, the first thing that needs to happen is you need to quickly understand who your user is, right? Again, I mentioned that multiple times, and understand what are the steps along their journey regarding the interaction of this thing or this product. Where are they first introduced to it? Where do they leave it behind? That whole step, and understand where are the where are the most obvious pain points for that overall experience. So the first thing is to ramp up as quick as possible as far as, okay, who's my user and what is their journey in their experience with the thing that I'm creating. And then you can start designing applicable tests that make sense, that can start, from that, understanding your journey, your user's journey, understanding your user, you start to develop a list of questions, right? And from those questions, you create a set of principles or priorities based on things you need to solve for. And then depending on that specific scenario, you start, there's a hierarchy to that on what you need to solve first in order to make that an ideal experience.
Mm-hmm. Good point. So working into our 3 closing questions now. So first question, and the Wall Hub experiment was an amazing example of ingenuity and resourcefulness to test an idea quickly and cheaply. And it discovered that customers would inherently pay for the product. Are there any other experiments that you've performed that have reframed client perspective or organizational perspective? Maybe a different way to think about it have shifted business or internal assumptions.
Yeah. So, without breaching any confidentiality issues, we had a recent client who had an idea for a product. And this is what we do a lot of times. A lot of times, we don't, a lot of the things we design or test, it's valuable. The things that don't go to market are sometimes as valuable as the things they do because of the money they save, the mistakes they save companies from making as far as an investment goes. And we recently did that for a company who, there was a popular game involved, and they were thinking about an accessory that would make it an even more interesting experience. And we went down the same methodology in this path of understanding who the user is. How do they interact with this game? How do they play it? Would this thing be of need? At the end of the day, we created prototypes, physical functioning prototypes, that people could test, that worked great. But, the quick discovery was like, yeah, as cool as that is and as well as that works, it doesn't really work with your target demographic, or at the very least, the early adopters who would kind of then, push this thing out, whether through YouTube channels or whatever. So, while the thing was cool, it turned out that it wasn't the right solution for the problem or for the end user. And the client wound up just nixing the whole program rather than ramping up a giant team, thinking about manufacturing and distribution. You save tens of millions of dollars when you avoid a track like that.
Mm-hmm. Did they pivot the solution or they killed the idea completely?
They mothballed it for a little bit. The idea probably got killed as far as solving some still user needs that exist there. That's TBD on next step. Is it a digital solve? Is it a physical solve? Software solve? What's how do you make that better?
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. One of the key benefits of performing early stage product experiments is that it provides you with an opportunity to stop an idea if there's not demonstrated interest or demand, which then allows you to repurpose business capital onto other projects and other initiatives. So really good example. So thinking about some resources that you'd recommend to our listeners, what are some of those key focus areas you'd recommend for listeners?
Yeah, I guess, I was having a conversation with someone about this earlier about, how technology, like for me personally, and this could be totally different, but I subscribe to platforms, whether it's like Google News or Apple News, and I just got keywords of things that interest me, I like looking at TED Talks to see what's going out there, or like keywords for me are, design research, user experience. And then the beauty of the technology in these new platforms is that, I don't rely on one author or one writer or one publication for my news sources, and I think this is probably a commentary on the larger problem with society and how we typically rely on one media source for all information. But I think the same holds true for research and gathering information, is that, I like to gather information from multiple sources on the same topic before I come up with an opinion on something, or I decide that something is absolute, at least in my opinion, or something that I would lean on. So, my space is anything that's inventive or new, or, that revolves around technology. Accessibility is huge to me right now, and that's accessibility for all disabilities, at this point. So like, that's where my interests lie, and the challenge of creating a good user experience for people who are able-bodied is hard enough. And when you layer on top accessibility issues, I think then you get significantly challenged. And I love that challenge. I think it's one that we morally need to confront as designers as well. And, we're starting to see a shift from that from clients. Like, I think there are people out there, without saying any names, that are really starting to pay attention to from a moral obligation as well as a business obligation, as making things accessible as possible.
Mm. Okay, so summarizing there, so a good way to think about learning and exploration discovery about new information and resources is to elevate that up into areas of interest, and then aggregate information, and then distill it down, and start to form your own philosophy and opinions about that space, rather than relying on one book or one blog.
Yeah, and for those looking to do cheap user research, Amazon reviews. I don't think there's a better resource. If you dig and comb through that, you can start to pull out little nuggets that can help inform decision making.
Good tip. And last question: if listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to find you?
I would say justin@upwelldesign.com. That's the best way to contact me. My site's online at jporcano.com, but it's not a public site, unfortunately. So the best way is by email. Excellent.
Thanks so much for the chat today, Justin. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gavin.
That's all from this episode of Experimentation Masters. Just one more thing before we say goodbye. We can use your help to keep improving the show. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, you can email at gavin@firstprinciples.ventures. Visit firstprinciples.ventures for show notes, resources, and information. If you enjoyed this show, give us a share on social media. Make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. Experimentation Masters. Lead with more confidence.